In the House of Parliament in England, there is an old tradition called a division bell, which used to be a literal bell. Now it's an alarm. And when the speaker would ring the bell, he would summon the people, members of the House, that they would come out of the hallways, out of the places where they were, come back into the chamber, and they would cast a vote. So whenever they rang the bell, the debate was over. The members would convene, the vote would be cast so the nation could move on. The ringing of the bell ended debate and moved the nation forward. I wish somebody would ring one today, huh? The reason I start with that is because I think that that the bell also divides. It shows us when a person votes where the real fault lines are. And sometimes the fault lines are not where we think they are. They are somewhere else. The narrative on the surface can be one thing, but at the ringing of the bell, a person has to reach down into the depths of their convictions, all of their experience, and they have to call those assumptions forward and articulate them in the form of a vote. And that's what people remember. I found as I was reading through Ezra-Nehemiah this last week, I wasn't expecting to go this way. I felt like I kept hearing a division bell. I felt like the house, the people of God were being divided, and the lines were not where I thought they were. The lines are somewhere else. Now, I'm not saying that the lines we think are there are not true. I'm simply saying in addition to those, there are deeper, more subtle differences that are dividing us. And by us, I'm speaking now of the church. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking to us. I want to speak to the body at College West. Would that be okay? I love the narrative of Ezra and Nehemiah because I think it captures so much of what is needed in our nation today and what is needed in the local church. Let me tell you why. The Old Testament scholar Walt Brueggemann says that the three tasks of a prophet is to speak truth or reality into denial and propaganda. The second task is to speak lament or penance into anger and blame. And the third task is to speak hope and promise into despair and resignation. Let me tell you how I think that plays out. I think these are not just three tasks that a prophetic church will have on the culture. I think these are actually phases. It seems to me that whenever a kingdom or an empire is in charge, they spin narratives and they live generally while the kingdom is in decline. The leaders of it tend to spin narratives in propaganda. And so the role of a prophetic church is to speak truth and reality to the empire when it is surrounded with its own propaganda. Are you there? This is a powerful function of a prophet. When you hear people saying a few years ago that they are speaking truth to power, this is what they're talking about. They're saying power has ensconced itself with privileges and layers of bureaucracy, and the role of the prophet is to speak reality to the empire because the empire keeps denying reality. The things are crumbling and they won't admit it. Once the empire, once the public starts to come to grips with that reality, then society wonders, what do we do with that if we were to own these accusations that you're saying against us? Now the prophet, or the prophetic church, rises up and says the proper response from the word of God is lament. There must be penance and confession of sin for the things our society has done. And the tendency of the empire is to get angry and to blame one another. Which is exactly, here's the only political thing I'll say all day. It's exactly what I see among some of the leaders right now who are vying for the most prestigious seats. Somebody taught me a long time ago that the only leader in the building is the one person not blaming someone else. And right now, there is nothing but blame from one person to another and from the other back to the one. I'm left wondering, is there still a leader in the house? Because anger and blame is the default response whenever one can no longer avoid the obvious. And this is where the prophet says, you're right to feel what you feel, but you should not blame. You should absorb the loss, and you should go into lament and grief. And you should do penance for the sins that society has committed. Are you still there? Once society gets into that low state of grief, they tend to slide into despair. They tend to resign. They tend to say, you're right, we have no future, we've been wrong, and then they tend to stay there. They get stuck in exile. And the role of the prophet is now to come along and say, wait a minute, there is hope and there is promise for the people of God after the lament. And now they are to call the people of God up out of their exile, out of their ashes, into something that is bigger and larger than anything they have seen before. And that is the other role of the prophet. Are you guys still, it's quiet out here. Dadgum, I'm thinking, man, I ought to write this down. This is what's needed right now. And this is why I think the Ezra-Nehemiah narrative is so powerful, because I think, frankly, a few years ago, we did have to we had to face some of our sins. We can no longer deny them. And so our tendency was to slip into blame and anger. And then the prophet could have come along and said, wait a minute, right feeling, wrong response. The right response is for you to lament and grieve what you have done. And now I think society is there. It feels to me like our culture today is just tired of blame and accusation. Or is it just me? I mean, all of the vitriol on social media, all of the mic drop rants, all of the slogans and the protests, right or wrong, they're getting old. We've heard these things. And I feel this collective gasp of society saying, can somebody say something new? Does somebody have a vision about what the future is? Because as surely as we come out of exile, the next argument, I promise you, will be over what is the new future. Are you there? All of these people that were speaking truth to power a few years ago need to be speaking hope to despair today. because that's the other function of a prophet. If all you do is speak truth to power, you're not a prophet, you're an activist. A prophet will bring the people lower and then bring them higher on the promises of God. And so there is a need for the church to get in front of society and say, the God who has brought us down has a vision for a renewed society, and it is bigger than you can imagine. Any church that has a message like that for the culture, I think, would be attractive. Yes? All right, so back to Ezra-Nehemiah. Can I go back to the story for a second? I'll hurry. I mentioned to you that a while ago, last week, that the story began when a Persian king, an unlikely source, decided to write an edict. And when he wrote it, he said, all of God's people that are living in exile, as many as want to go up, are free to go up and rebuild the temple of the God of Jerusalem. It was like, oh man, this is amazing. And so the building began, and it came in 3 waves. The first wave went back and built the temple. The second wave, and Ezra was in that one, came back and rebuilt the community. And then the third wave, and Nehemiah was in that one, came back and rebuilt the city. Are you still there? So we started with the temple, and then the temple built the community, and then the community built the city. Is a fundamentally different picture of how cities are renewed. Back in Nehemiah's day, they simply said there is no separation of church and state. You couldn't possibly rebuild the city until first you build a temple. And this is not the job of priests, it's the job of priests and leaders in the city. That's what I mean. This narrative is like everything you know upside down. And so the people began to move back to Jerusalem to build the temple. And I mentioned last week, briefly, that there were 3 classes of people. There were those who never left Israel because Babylon didn't want them. So they stayed in Israel, and they would gather in a burned out, ruined temple. It's what was left of the temple. God had left, but they would continue to gather in these rituals that they'd practiced for decades. Only God was absent. But these were devoutly religious people, and their theology was pretty good, and their rituals impeccable. It's just, it was vacant. There was nobody home. The second group were people that moved to Babylon, and they got enculturated. They settled down. They started businesses, had families, planted vineyards, took offices, found power, and Babylon started to feel pretty comfortable. These are good people. They just don't want to go back to Jerusalem and build a temple when they've got a pretty good life right now in Babylon. And then there was this third group of people who I called the re-enchanted. And these people were pretty much the children of parents that had babies in exile. So in other words, what I'm telling you is these children had never been to Jerusalem because exile was 70 years long, and they were born in Babylon. They knew nothing about Jerusalem, nothing about a temple, had never seen one. And yet, Ezra said, when Cyrus signed that edict, God moved the heart of these people in ways that he didn't move everybody else. And can I spin this just for a second? These people then in the third category, they were not what people in the first category would call religious. Because they were what people in the first category would call the lost, the world. And yet, God had moved the heart of some of them in this category in ways that he did not move the heart of even the devoutly religious. And here is the first division bell. You find yourself saying, "Daggum." That's Greek for whoa. How is it that the real divide in Ezra and Nehemiah is not between the church and the world? It is not between who are saved and who are unsaved. It is between those whose heart God has moved and those who are yet unmoved. When when Jeremiah tells the parable of the figs, the good figs and bad figs in Jeremiah 24, what he says is the bad figs are the people that were devoutly religious, worshiping in run-down churches. And the good figs are people that grew up in Babylon and had little formal religion in them, but there was something genuine in their heart. Do you hear what the prophet is saying? The good figs and the bad figs are different, but not according to the categories you're used to thinking. You're used to thinking if a person is in church, then they're a good fig. And if they're not in church, then they're a bad fig who needs to become a good fig. And this is weird. And what Ezra, Nehemiah, and Jeremiah are saying is, you've got the categories right, but the fault line is not where you think it is. The line is between people whose heart God has moved and those who are yet unmoved. And some of the ones who are unmoved are still in church. So if you sit and you rely on all of the external symbols of this, and you draw a circle around yourself and say, this is what it means to be a follower of God, and you do not leave open the possibility that God is moving in hearts of people that are not yet in the kingdom of God, you are missing the point. The point is God is on the move, and it's not always where you think it is. We could wrap this up right now. We ain't, but we could. There's one more fault line that I want to get to because I think it's the critical one that deals with the church itself, and it comes in Ezra chapter 3. And what I can't figure out in Ezra chapter 3 is how it is verse 1 jives with verse 12 and 13. Verse 1 says, on the same day, all of the people gathered as one person in the public square in order to lay the foundation of the temple. And verse 12 and 13 says, when the foundation of the temple was laid, this group of one body split. And some of them were praising God and saying, this is amazing. And the other ones were weeping out loud, saying, oh, this is nothing like what it used to be. And here again, I hear a division bell. I see all of the people gathered in one congregation. They're all singing from the same hymnal. That's the psalm. The Lord is good, he endures forever. They're all following the liturgy of Moses. The priests are in their vestments. They're banging cymbals and blowing trumpets. Everything is as it should be. They're worshiping the same God. They want the same thing. Rebuild the temple, they all say. But then, when we actually build the foundation, the bell rings. And half of them start to complain. And they're complaining because the present temple is nothing like the last one. Are you there? Are you there? This is one of the divides in the church today. It is not between liberal or progressive and conservative or traditional. It is between those who love the former glory and those who want the future glory. And they're in the same church, and they sing from the same hymnal. They follow the same leaders and the same liturgy, and they want the same thing, they say. They want the church to grow. They want it to thrive. But they differ sharply over what it looks like when the church has its glory back. May I speak to them, those of us, and I'll put myself in your company because I'm old enough to be in your company. Look, I'm in the second service. I'm older than most of you. What those of us who love the former glory have is we have in our past a genuine encounter with God in our religion and faith. And that encounter was a deep experience that marked us for the rest of our life. That will never go away. And when we talk about what the church used to be, we often use the word revival, which generally when old people use it means everything goes back to pretty much the way that it was before. And I want to remind you that while the temple that used to be is wildly impressive, the numbers I've heard are that if you were to rebuild it today according to the specs, it would cost in the billions to pull this off. This thing was a spectacle, not only to Israel, but to the nations. And I mean, they came by thousands into and it was what it stood for. You went to the temple to get your advice. You went to the temple to cast your vote. You went to the temple to pay your taxes. You went to the temple to recite your vows. The temple was the epicenter of the culture. And so those who love the former temple are sometimes saying, man, and that's what we need in this country. We need the church to get back to being the center of this country. So that's where thousands of people stream and say their vows and pay their taxes, well, tithe. But can I remind you, this temple is also the one that Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 1 that when they cite prayers, I don't listen. And when they cry out to heaven, I hide my eyes. Because they are full of power and corruption, he says. And why? And the prophet says, because they pay no attention to the vulnerable. So all the while, this temple was the center of society and it had all the trappings of success. There was this undercurrent that was undermining the authority of God. Are you still there? And I see this somehow in the traditional church that so many in our country long for. I mean, we want a church that is large and that's the center and that's in control and that We'll get our guy elected, doggone it. And I hear the prophet Haggai say, after the temple's been destroyed, the real dividing line is over glory. Some of you want the glory of the former, and some of you are excited about the glory of the future. And those of you that are lost yet in the former glory keep trying to bring things back to the days of revival. And I'm telling you, says the prophet, God is not just going to revive the temple, he's going to create a new one, entirely new, that is suited for the day in which you live. And what is new is not the refurbishing of what is old. It's not a bigger, shinier, more majestic version that's more impressive. It's sometimes less impressive. It's not as big. It doesn't have a big personality in front of it with a big band. Oh, no. Let's go way back with an organ and a piano. Remember that? Oh, Pastor, we used to sing hymns, theology. Yeah, but nobody sang. And we had special music. We had a meeting in our church one time. And I said, what is it about worship that's bugging you? And they said, there's no special music. I thought, yeah, some of them could sing. And the sermons, they're not what they used to be. I mean, you used to dress up, you don't anymore, and you walk out and you talk about, you don't even have the Bible in your hand. Someone said, you don't even use the text. And when you come to the end of a sermon, you don't call us to the altar. And I thought they meant that. No, they meant this. You don't call us to have a decision. Why, back in the day, we were getting saved 4 times. The sermons were so good. So you can feel when someone talks like that, it isn't change they fear, it's loss. They think they're losing some kind of glory. And what I told you a moment ago, there was a glory in that. That's just not where the temple is going. So as we come out of this loop and as society and the church with it starts to envision a brand new temple, what will it be like? I pick up the books of Ezra-Nehemiah and I read them, and this is what I find in general. The temple that God is going to build is smaller, much smaller, but it is more powerfully engaged in its cities than the one we used to worship in. It may not gather by the thousands, but the repercussions of the lives of the few that gather in that temple will be so powerful that it will exude across society. The temple that God is building will not be one with illustrious figures, big lead pastors, and rock star bands with TED Talks that follow. The one that God is building will be built by the people. There is a remarkable pattern in Ezra and Nehemiah that there is no one leader that's pulling this off. It's the people of God who give generously. It's the people who gather as one. It's the people who lay the foundation. It's the people who say the liturgies. There are priests and there are Levites, but it is the people themselves who are doing this. And so the temple that God is building will be a combination of both preachers and non-preachers, put it that way. And what's even more, and I love this, there is in Ezra and Nehemiah this combination of politicians and priests, and they're both working on the same thing. I know this, it's like when they gather to lay the foundations of the temple, the governor is there. The governor is laying the footing of the temple because the governor knows you couldn't possibly build a city unless you have a strong temple. And when it comes time to rebuild the city wall and to renew the streets that were set on fire, it's the priests. It's the priests. It's not the activists that are actually laying the brick. So you got this whole American church state. You build the church, we'll build the state. And what you have in Ezra-Nehemiah is they're crossing over the wall and they're building each other. You're like, oh, that'll never happen. Well, not in the old temple. See, you can't even think outside of your categories. Every definition you have of success was soaked in old temple imagination. What if God does something new between the leaders of a church and the leaders of a city, so that when the church gathers, they think not only of themselves, they think of the city. And when the city gathers, they think more than just how do we use the church for volunteers and to get elected. They actually come over and help to build the temple that builds the church. Man, would that be a day. I gotta hurry here. The temple that God is building is more reverent. Now, let me be careful about this. It is less formal than it used to be, but it's more sacred. Because in the temple God is building, I'll talk about this next week, and this is in my blood, you guys. Give me a week to figure it out, but it's in my blood. In the American church, the center of gravity has moved from the altar to the pastor. And the present generation, including me, is tired of that. We think the center of gravity has to move away from bands and speakers, and it has to get back to the altar, that thin place between heaven and earth where men and women say their vows and God hears. And so the church that is coming will not be a church that has an altar. It will be an altar that builds a church. All right, I'll wrap it up with an easy one. The church that is coming will be political. Relax. I said first hour, I'm expecting oxygen masks to come out of the sky and you guys start inhaling. Now, don't load it with modern day baggage. The word comes from the Greek word polis, which means city, and from the other Greek word polites, which means citizen. So when something is political, it is aimed at flourishing the life of citizens who live in the city, full stop. Are you all right? Can you breathe? That's all I mean by political. That the church God is building will not be an insular silo that focuses primarily on a gathering. It will be a church as committed to the sending and to the transformation of citizens who live in the city.